in that sense, even if there is like some kind of dissonance or whatever, that dissonance is part of the human being that I'm trying to embody, the identity that I'm trying to take on, right? Even if it was a character. And this is why I bloody respect actors, man, because they have to not just be priest and sacrificial lamb at the same time. Is that we've killed the priest and the lamb still has to die. So they have to make that identity from scratch. We've found the material, whatever they have, and they got to try and piece that together from whatever they've learned and hopefully have some fluency in the technique.
Hi, and welcome to the Quotidian podcast. I'm Bradley Dennis. This week I'm speaking with the theater performer, director, and teacher, Ethan Kobayashi-Hsieh. And Ethan is the creator of TIAMAT, which stands for the Integrative Approach and Methodology of Active Transformation. Put maybe more simply, Ethan's work uses theater as the means for practitioners to create an embodied, multivalent awareness of themselves as applies to their search for meaning and purpose. And I first encountered his work through John Vervaeke's podcast, and immediately I saw parallels to my own theories about theater as a pathway towards individuation, Carl Jung's term for the process of intense self-discovery and meaning-making. Now, in Ethan and John's work, it's proven inspirational to me, and I reached out to Ethan and began a conversation with him, which led to our recording of what you're about to see, which actually lasted nearly 2 hours. So I'm breaking this episode up into two for ease of digestion. And we get into kind of the nuts and bolts of how theater is uniquely suited as an ecology of practice and its immediacy of effect. And Ethan also explores deeper aspects of his work as related to Vervaeke's theories of meaning making. And I'm thrilled to have had this conversation, and I look forward to more. And I just want to take a second and say that if you like what you're seeing and you're hearing here on the Quotidian, please let us know. Subscribe, share widely, comment, and most of all, thank you for being here. So please enjoy this dialogue with Ethan Kobayashi-Hsieh. Thanks. So to begin with, I want to welcome you, Ethan, to the Quotidian. Great to have you here. Good to see you again.
Glad to be here. Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me, brother.
Yeah. Before we kind of dive into stuff, I just want to check in with you and see how you're doing, how this moment finds you.
Yeah. Well, it's about like 10:30 p.m. at the moment. So I'm kind of winding down at the end of the day. Yeah, it's been a really hectic week. A lot of really exciting stuff, deep conversations that I've had to have with myself and with other people over the past 14 or so days. So mentally, I kind of feel like I'm at the peak. I'm like around like 80% optimal. And that's been that way for like way longer than I usually expect it to be. Yeah. Yeah. And emotionally, I feel kind of like settled, actually. I feel quite comfortable with you. And so I'm looking forward really to like getting into the meat of this stuff, especially because I just, was listening to the last conversation that we had privately and off camera, and wow, I really, really miss the kind of like bounce back and forth that we have. So excited to be here. Thanks, brother.
Wonderful. That's great. So to begin with, I'll do a little intro blurb about the conversation that we're going to having, a little bit of background about you, but I'm curious just personally as a performer, a bit of your background and how you came to know yourself as a performer and how that evolved for you.
Yeah, against my will feels like the best way to say it. Yeah, I grew up in a very domestically abusive household. And So something was really interesting, which I think set me on this kind of path of figuring out how acting works, like in the mind, is while I was being like sort of beat on by my mom, she had a tendency to kind of like point and say like, oh, look, he's faking it, right? Like I'll be a 5-year-old kid crying in a corner and it's like, oh, it's fake. And so, 5-year-old me doesn't know what the hell is going on. So I kind of go, really? Am I? Right. And so as a kid, we do that physiological sigh thing of like, and I can actually stop kind of what I'm doing. And then she looks at that and then she goes, oh, you see, he can stop it at will. Right. And like, I go, oh my God, really? But everything kind of feels very real and very visceral for me.
Yes.
And so I just kept playing around with that for many, many years. And then when I was about 15, I found out I could make money off of that. So
I've always been of the mind that actors are incredibly gifted in disassociation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of an integral part.
Yeah. That you found that in kind of awful circumstances quite early.
Yeah. It's interesting because like that's kind of a lot of the work that I do is working with people who have some form of dissociation, and actually it's kind of made me change my stance on it a little bit, because it's not so much about dissociating, which is kind of like the involuntary movement of your attention to something else. Acting feels like it's a voluntary movement of attention.
It's controlled.
Right? And it's controlled and very precise. And so when we look at the scientific literature around wisdom cultivation, which is the other part of where I'm bringing all of my attention to, the way that we maneuver our attention can and does very strongly affect the way that we are motivated towards things. And that comes into question like, okay, well, what do we value? Right. And then those motivations affect our emotions, our behavior, and then it cascades down into construction of identity and then how we interact in the world with that identity. And the line for me in terms of the mechanics of acting is precisely aligned to all of that machinery. And so that's why I think like I'm particularly interested in the cognitive science, because it offers a little bit of a naturalistic explanation, for this crazy thing that as actors we do. Yeah.
It's fascinating too, because you're talking about the mechanics of consciously disassociating in terms of survival of trauma on one hand, or unconsciously rather, and then in acting consciously, and a very finely tuned, almost a motor skill of being able to separate those integral pieces. And one way that I've heard acting described is it's the art of being human, that it's an intense, integral research of the full range of both emotional and physical, I would say, mental and spiritual aspects of being human.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head really there in terms of like the implicit question is then, how do we learn to do that voluntarily? Right. And that comes into my work. I stopped performing on stage a long time ago. A lot of my work now is much more as a practice researcher and as an actor trainer. And so I'm deeply invested in this process of how do we create a pedagogical framework, but also an ecology of practices that teaches us how to do that, and of course the theater history tells there's so many different ways to go about it. So what's the point of convergence, right? Where do they meet? And is there some kind of common ground, which is not to say that I'm pushing for a universal acting technique. I think there's always going to be a great deal of diversity across cultures and practices and styles and genres and disciplines. But fundamentally where it sits is, as you rightly pointed out, being human. So to engage in the process of learning to act, to engage in the process of trying to discover oneself in an enactive form, man, that's self-knowledge. That's deep work on yourself. Yes. And I'm super fascinated at that, because part of the reason why we connected is because we were working on this thing called the theater of self, and I love that we have this kind of commonality between us, because then we can really get down deep into the weeds about something. How's that landing with you?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And as you're talking, I'm reminded of the work of Eugenio Barba and the anthropology of performance and anthropology of theater, where he's looking at this, as much as possible, the global similarities of how these very different pedagogies express the same things, whether it's, the specific mudras, risi, or no theater, or mime, wherever it is that you have the same sort of prima materia that you're working with, but the cultural lens through which it shines expresses it in its a different color, as it were. Yeah. It's all visible light, but you're seeing sort of different bandwidths of it. So I'm really curious about something that you said also, as we kind of are looking at your experience in theater. I also had kind of a disenchantment with performance per se, because it felt so disjointed from everyday experience. It felt like it was suddenly on a pedestal. I didn't like how I felt, how I was becoming, what theater and entertainment represent in our culture. Mm-hmm. But I'm very much enamored and, in the true sense of the word, enchanted by what the process affords. If we're going to talk a little bit in Vervaekean terms, the affordance, as we develop the salience landscaping, what that process, what that practice affords us in terms of becoming better in every sense of the word, in our competence, in our spirituality, in our physical practice, that sense of embodied ecology of practice really, it teaches us. It's a continual teaching, but it's also an awareness. So I'm really curious for you, because you did some real rigorous study, since we're kind of talking a bit about pedagogy and non-pedagogy, what it was about your journey that you found particularly useful in what you do now.
Wow. Okay. So
there's a lot there.
There's a lot there. And so, like, what I'm hearing from that question is, what parts of my training made me interested in the training itself?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is really fascinating to me, because when we talk about salience landscaping, in this case, to mean, for if people are not familiar with the term, right, a salience landscape means what stands out to you, right? So what's relevant to you, what sticks out, and then those things connect together to form a kind of tapestry, if you will, of things that stand out. Well, I actually kind of always had a problem with pedagogies, particularly for acting. And it was really bizarre, because I started out fairly young. And then as things got much more technical, I also felt rather disillusioned by it. And I remember this in like my first day at drama school. We were all made to stand around in a circle. And then, we'd been running around the room for 2 hours, and everyone was exhausted. And, it's psychologically a kind of state of hyper suggestibility, right? And in that moment, we were asked to kind of step into the middle circle and declare your name and declare, I am an actor. And there was this part of me that went like, well, this is really brainwashy, isn't it? And it's like, it felt really, really weird. So, sort of that same sense of like dissociation or disconnect arrived. And something really amazing happened in that moment, because it's kind of like a crossroads. And I had a choice to capitulate to the instruction or to go into the circle and just go, I'm Ethan and I'm a person. I'm me. I just am. Or I'm not. Right. And I was amazed at like how quickly I chose the former option. Right. And so there's and it's bizarre because like now when I think about it, I go like, there was something in the way that was done that made it so that that former choice felt like the most right option, despite knowing that others were there. And so this kind of carried on throughout the pedagogy, and it became this, it colored it in a way where it's like, well, you got to get the grade. You got to do this so that agents would pick you up. Mm-hmm. You got to do this so that the industry would X, X, Y, Y, Z, Z.
You have to follow the choreography.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Not just in dance class, but in the world, yes. Right? And it swallowed my life. Now, I think I was very lucky in a sense that I was a foreign student, studying in drama school in London, one of the most prestigious institutions, whose name I shall not mention. And so I was aware that I kind of wanted to go back to my home country. I wasn't going to work in that industry necessarily. And so it felt like a lot of the justifications they were levying wasn't applying. In that sense, I could take a look at the pedagogy isolated from their justifications. Does that make sense? Right. Yeah. I could look at it on its own. Mm-hmm. And so it got me really, really interested into like Linklater voice technique. For me is really fascinating. I particularly love that pedagogy. I had a wonderful teacher as well, Darren Oram. He really emphasized a lot the sensation of feeling sound in your body. And I had never really connected with my body that intimately because of a history of trauma and abuse. Right. And I found things opening up for me. I could actually feel genuine joy. When I could feel my rib cage vibrating. So, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah.
How is this occurring? And it was literally changing the way that I looked at the world.
Yeah.
In a proper sense, which keys us into kind of, if I think about it, it's a precursor to how I think about ritual. It's this sense that here is a kind of technical thing that you do, right? It's a physical thing that you can do. Mm-hmm. It's a conscious effort to introduce invariance into your system. You either do it or you don't. So there's a part of you that maintains that. And I would argue it's the same part of your mind that when you're performing and something really heated is happening on stage, that's the part of your mind that goes stage left, light, go now, right? So that part maintains the procedural, the proprioceptive, the active thing. Now, the other part is the part that turns inwards and looks at how one looks at the world. So it's the perspectival. So it's this delicate balance between what's being done and how it's affecting you.
Yes. Yeah. And the balance is a great way of describing it, because it very much is like, if you have ever tried spinning a plate on a stick, it's incredibly difficult until it clicks. And then once you've got that, this can become autonomous. It's kind of like we learn to walk, right? It's that same thing. I think part of the mechanics as a performer, as an actor on stage, you learn how to find your light. You learn how to really use your peripheral. And this is, as I'm listening to my language, peripheral awareness extends way beyond the visual. It extends through all sorts of sensory perceptible means. But that ability to almost run these things on autopilot, right? I know how to find a spot on stage. I know how, and you also do that with the audience as well. How to wait for laughter to subside, how to wait for, how to feel and manipulate attention. I heard Anne Bogart talking in Edinburgh once. she was giving a talk about her company and some of her processes. And she said, I have a performer who can manipulate time. And the whole room just kind of went, what? And, but I knew exactly what she was talking about, because it's that sense. To me, it's how to stay in the moment, how to stay present with yourself, with the character, whatever it is that you're portraying, but as well as the presence, the sense of what is being afforded to you by all these other people in the room who, whether they know it or not, are also playing a role. Right. And so I'm really, I hope we come back to this, because I think there's something very critical here in what it is that Tiamat is doing, what Theater of Self is trying to do, about how to bring those sort of psychotechnologies to bear on the everyday life and the everyday person. So back to
right. You want to come back to it? I'm not letting it go.
Good. Okay,
I'm not leaving it. We're staying there because you brought some really, really great points. I love this. Idea that Anne talks about an actor that can manipulate time. So in a lot of the TIAMAT practice, something that I hear constantly come up is this sensation of time dilation. So I love to do this, right? We always do an exercise which is foundational to the method. We call it the playground. And it's kind of based off of, it's an augmentation of an exercise that's in Stephen Wang's book, An Acrobat of the Heart. And so it's kind of trying to key into your stream of consciousness, but to enact it, right? And then I tend to use that as a diagnostic tool to try and work out kinks and to see what patterns exist. So I'm always kind of like on the outs watching the thing as it unfolds, and then I'll manage the space. So usually when we finish one of these exercises, I'd ask the actors, how long do you think that went for? And no one will ever give me the same answer. Someone will go, 15 minutes. Someone goes like half an hour. Someone goes and like, it felt like an hour. Someone goes like, it felt like I just started 5 minutes, and it'd always be different from our chronos, our qualitative time, right? So their phenomenological experience of time shifts. And this comes back to that thing that we talked about with balance here, which is that once you introduce invariance in the form of a ritual, okay, I know what I'm doing here, and I know what I am intentionally putting forward as a form, and I'm going to keep an eye on the perspectival, how it's changing what stands out to me, how it's affecting me inside the body, affecting my behavior, affecting the way I perceive the world. Now I can start to draw causal patterns between the form and how it's affecting me.
Yes.
And once that causal pattern starts to emerge, like you said, it's like spinning a plate on a stick, right? You start to become very tuned in to the tiny little shifts that are happening inside your hand. Those things become more salient. They stand out more, Now, what's really amazing about that is that we would normally, if we weren't in this balance, we wouldn't know what the hell is happening there. But once that balance is struck, you can pay attention to that thing and go, okay, if I shift it just like a little bit to the left, I've got it, right? And sure, I don't think anyone else would really care, but it's very significant to this person who's in that state. Man, that thing is going to start triggering dopamine loops. It's going to start triggering adrenaline. It's going to start triggering acetylcholine in your brain, and all of those things within our autonomic nervous system start to adjust our experience of time. It's a meditation, fundamentally.
Yes.
And so I really didn't want to run away from this, because you talked about it being, as actors on stage, and I will push back a little bit and say that it's also actors on set. It's also actors at work. It's also actors at home. It's actors online.
Actors walking down the street. It's also actors in an argument. Yes.
Yeah. In fact, it's just people. Yeah. Because we know the flow state is a universal experience. The literature on that's very clear, right? So when we're talking about, let's say, okay, actors on set, right? How do they need to adjust their salience landscaping? I need to remove the director of photography who has like a 35 millimeter lens this close to my face for like 2 minutes. I need to find that thing irrelevant as compared to the person that I'm talking to right now.
Yes.
And so all these little shifts that are happening in your face, that are happening in like just the background with you, that person who's walking past, whatever it is that the scene demands, I need to tune my salience landscaping to all of these things so that they affect me more than the DOP racking focus next to me.
Yeah.
That's a bloody skill. Right.
I had the lovely gift of an experience in watching my daughter learn to ride a bike recently. Now she's almost 12 and she's ignored that since we started when she was, 3. She can't stand being taught and she can't stand not being able to be perfect the first time she does something. But she was able to now get on the bike, experience failure over and over again until, just like you're describing, the differences in the sensation of her position on the bicycle began to make sense to her in a way that suddenly this narrow range of balance changed in perspective and scale so that, it's now seems huge to me. And this is the window. This is what my affordance, right? This is where I live in order to do this. And to see the flow state just blossom in that moment was amazing. And also because she's older than most kids are when they learn how to ride a bike,
right,
she was able to articulate that and be present with herself and the surroundings, her world, and me. And it was a real insight into exactly what you're talking about, right? In the same way that when we explore a crevice or something with our tongue on our teeth, it seems massive, right? The sort of the homunculus of that experience. But when you what is this on my teeth? And you look and you can't see it because it's so small. But in your mind, in your experience of it, is massive.
It's huge.
I feel like that's exactly what you're describing is, once you're able to feel the muscle, feel the sensitivity of that salience landscaping of all of that awareness mechanism, you're able to block out the DOP. You're able to block out the lights and to really, I feel like coaching is very much like that as well.
Yes,
like coaching reminds me of directing, so that very much lands with me in that.
Okay, so you've given me 2 wonderful gifts here, and I want to definitely. I will come back to the coaching thing later on because that's a shared endeavor that we have. But I cannot let go of how much this anecdote about your daughter has my attention. I'm kind of curious around when you said that she managed to articulate that process. She managed to articulate her placement of attention. It sounds like. Can you tell me? Do you mind revealing a little bit about what she said? How did she the minutia of that?
Not at all. So this is a child who is exceptionally creatively focused. She's a writer. She loves language. She has always been in that state, and her facility with language is pretty remarkable. And so she was physically bubbling over. There was just that awareness, that sense of, I feel different. And so both in her physical expression, but also as I said, how does that feel? Her name's Evie. I said, how does that feel to you, Evie? And she said, it's like flowing water. It's like giggling. It's, and so there was this immediate transportation of experience into expression. So there was the feeling of it that she was being very present with, and I get tears coming to my mind just thinking about how beautiful it was, and also the gift of that for her, that someone who is normally, and I think about adults, I think about trauma when I talk about this, who are closed down to potentialities of experience because of preconceived notions of either how things are supposed to be or how they are supposed to comport themselves in the world, right?
Yeah.
That it's almost like putting a lens cap on things, or blinders, right? This is all I'm allowed myself. There's a great line in Stoppard's play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. He says, audiences know what to expect, and that's all they're prepared to believe in. And oftentimes I feel like that about people as well. Like, we know what to expect out of life. That's what we've been taught. That's what our trauma has conditioned us to do. It's what our experiences have conditioned us to do. It's what our teachers have conditioned. And I think a big part of what I witnessed in Evie, and what I often see in theater students, either mine or what I have experienced myself, is that moment when not only are the blinders coming off, but I can take them off, and I'm able to adjust the focus. And that sense, that's flow in a lot of ways. But there's something deeper to that. Like, flow to me is a deep connection to virtuosic, or almost virtuosic, a high degree of facility with something that allows you to express whatever it is you're trying to express in the moment. But there's something particularly, and we touched on this when we were talking a little bit before we started recording, that's distinct about the theatrical experiment that goes beyond flow to me, because it affords an awareness that flow ebbs and flows. I mean, that's sort of self-defining, but it comes to a conclusion. Like, we don't have the ability to keep going with that, but something about what is gained in acting training and performance training and that sort of theatrical mindset, it's almost like it doubles its half-life, or it extends its. It's because you know that you are in the experiment constantly, and that every moment is a chance to learn, and that you're constantly gaining information, right? Like, if I'm walking down the street behind someone and I'm fascinated by their walk, and I try it on for a little while, right? Now I'm able to afford a perspectival knowing and a salience landscaping that was not available to me before, simply because I mimicked that suit. I put those qualities on myself, even though that person may be huge or small or thin or thick or whatever the case may be. I am now jumping into a completely new frame of reference.
Way of being.
Yes.
Yeah,
so
frame of reference.
There's something very different about that sense of flow. So I've kind of gone a little away from Evie's experience, but I think that they're similar in that way.
Yeah. So, like, I really appreciate you bringing this up, because when we're talking about having a frame of reference, we're talking about a way of being. We're trying to tie together flow state, and I want to try and connect these dots. So a lot of why I found that anecdote particularly emotionally provoking for me in a good way, or emotionally evoking for me, is that, the way that Evie describes that experience is imagistic, and that really stuck out for me. So I'm a big fan of Jung, and this, and of course, coming from a depth psychology background, like, we have a commonality, we have a common friend in Carl, right? And so when I was talking to John on his podcast months ago, we were talking about this idea of a symbol being an existential relationship. that it fundamentally changes the way that you exist in the world. And I really, really, truly want to credit Jung for this, because when he talks about symbols, I really don't think he's talking about it propositionally. He can't be. Right?
No, he's talking about it archetypally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
And how we come into a relationship with that symbol in the way that Evie did with the flowing of the water is not that is not at the point where she's telling you about it. It's at the point where she's riding the bike. She's becoming water as she's riding the bike.
Yes.
And it's overwhelming, right? It's very giggly, like she said, right? So there is an affective dimension to this. So we can do that at will, as you rightly pointed out, by, taking somebody on, right? And saying, okay, well, what's it like to be in your worldview first somatically, right? With the body. And maybe if we key into the idea of this ritual balance that I was just articulating earlier, then that somatic experience is going to affect the way I perceive the world and the way I be in the world. And that's the psychophysical work, obviously coming from a Grotowskian tradition. I have to lean into that a little bit more, right? Is that the body does affect the way that we perceive the world. Mm-hmm. Now, the way we perceive the world then affects our motivations. What does it make me want to do? How does it make things stand out to me that is different from the way that it was 20 seconds ago before I started walking like this person? Mm-hmm. And mind you, all that happens at will. Now, where I want to add on, I think, something that I'm working on at the moment, but is also quite interesting to key back into the first thing that we were just talking about. And this question of reassociation at will is that when you're in a theatrical setting, right, there's an audience there, someone's watching. It's very different from being on the street and mimicking someone's walk. There is an observer present. And so that flow state might still occur, but guess what? There's a part of the mind that sits in the observer's position and watches the flow state happening, right? So then something here becomes, I think, particularly instrumental in the sense of being able to follow the light cue, right? Is that now that part of the mind can go, well, how can I keep this flow state going on?
I was just thinking that. It's like that observer pushes the gas pedal.
Yeah.
Steers the flow.
Absolutely. And this is something that we talk about in TIAMAT, usually in the first session. I'll ask people this question of like, was there anything you wanted to do that you didn't do? And so, usually people will have something that they go, I wish that I had.
Can I ask a clarifying question about that?
Yeah, sure.
Do something that you didn't get a chance to do or wanted to do. Do you mean that in terms of in the framework of an exercise or in a workshop, or what's the sense of?
Right. In the exercise. So in the context of an improvisation or in a scene or something like that. Right. So I'll ask them this question. And then, they'll usually bring up something like, I wished I actually wanted to pick up the cup. And then like, I kind of did that. And then you see them fritz out for a little bit. I'm like, okay. So what did you do instead? And sometimes it's, I don't know. And sometimes it's, I just, I think I sat down or something like that. It's very difficult to recall. So it's fascinating, that like they can remember the moment of resistance and not the capitulation to something else afterwards. And we call that moment, right? I'll then ask them, well, how did it feel to do that thing the alternate thing instead of the thing you want to do? And they go, I don't know, it just felt like, all right. I'll go, well, great. Well, that's the bullshit light. It's that light that goes off when you go like, if you're on stage and you're supposed to do something, you kind of don't really believe it, but you gotta do it. Yeah. Because otherwise the stage manager will yell at you later during intermission.
Ethan, right? You were late. you didn't hit that line. You didn't pick up the pencil.
I didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
I didn't want to. Yeah. So it's in that moment that it's like, wow, they go, oh shit, that bullshit like exists, and I'll tell them like, yeah, well, you're in control of that. and that's where I kind of push people towards agency, and I'm trying to tie into that thing that we want to come back to with coaching.
Yeah.
It's like, what is the role of a coach, right? This idea that, at the peak of it, at least for me, I'm more interested in engaging somebody's creative and cognitive agency in a room when they're working with me, and it's how I direct, it's how I train actors as well. It's also how I coach people, is this question of like, if you really wanted to do that thing, okay, and you didn't do it, why not? And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of reasons why you should or shouldn't do something, right? Like if you want to go and kill somebody, for example, right? I'm not trying to say, go and do whatever you want. It's take a deeper look at why you did or didn't do that thing.
Yes.
And it's often those points where, like in this example that I just gave, where we kind of fritz out and we don't know why we didn't do that thing. Maybe it's worth questioning that. Maybe it's worth figuring out, okay, I chose not to do that actually. I might not know why I chose not to do that, but I can figure it out.
It's subliminal at that point. Yeah.
Yes. As opposed to unconsciously not doing the thing you wanted to do. You see, it's a very, very like subtle kind of balance.
It is.
And so this comes to that question of like, as a coach, is that something that you notice that you employ also in the way that you work with people? Or is that purely an idiosyncratic thing that I'm doing?
I will tell you for myself, that is the crux of the coaching experience for me, is to be as present with myself as possible at every moment, so that I'm charting not just what's happening for my client, but what's happening for me. Because in the same way, we're talking about this very fine membrane between the actor's observer mind, writing, helping to manipulate, control the corpus, the vehicle.
Yeah.
There's also moments when the observer sort of lets go of the reins, right? You know how to spin the plate well enough that you don't have to look at it and think about it. So that can happen. Now I'm going to let go of the reins so that you can actually, you can enter into the brief madness, the illusion of this thing. I have just enough of a thread attached that when I get to the end of the soliloquy, or when I get to the end of this movement phrase, I can tug on that, and that brings me back to just enough of an awareness of the observer to do what's needed to stay in the form.
Yes. That's the procedural maintenance of ritual. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, if we're going to look in a ritual context, that's the fact that everybody in an actual ritual, there's no audience in a ritual. Everyone is a participant, whether they have an active role in, I'm thinking particularly of like a Haitian voodoo ceremony where everyone knows the drum beats, everyone knows the different gods, the loa that are present in the pantheon. All of the props for each of the gods are available, but they don't know who's going to show up. But when you see someone whose observer lets go of the reins, and one of these archetypes becomes formed into an archetypal image of, let's say, Papa Gede or Baron Samedi or Erzuli, everybody says, "Oh shit, they're here.
Yeah.
Let's go get the props." And they, so Baron Samedi, here's your hat, here's your glasses, here's your cigarette, here's your cane. The drums change to specifically the drums that this Loa, this god, likes. Everybody knows that. So there is no audience. Although we're all watching, we are, it's very much, it echoes throughout a bunch of different spiritual traditions. But in this one, everyone is a participant. There is no interlocutor except as is chosen by the moment.
Okay.
So, I've kind of taken us into a different place here. But you said ritual, so we're going there.
Oh yeah, that feels to be a through line that's running around this conversation. So there are, I think, this idea of everybody knows who is what when they show up, and at the same time, there's also this kind of like looseness around. We don't know who's going to show up, but we know when they do. Right. And we have our stuff ready. And what comes up for me is Hamlet, the readiness is all. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it not be now, yet it will come. Right. So I find that a really wonderful poetic exemplification of this kind of metastability that and this is dynamic systems theory coming in, that there's a certain degree of consistency in the way that a stand-up comedian has a certain repertoire of jokes, but you're not going to be able to predict if somebody's going to heckle you or how hard they're going to laugh or how long, but you know how you can deal with that, right? Yes. So this dynamic interplay between this kind of order and chaos is present. Now, I do, on the back of that, have a little bit of pushback, because I would argue that the act of listening itself, the audience itself, is active. It's an active listening.
Absolutely.
And that it should be, I think it should be. I'm not sure about our hit rate at this point when it comes to live performance, especially after COVID, and that will take us to a different discussion, which is not a thread I want to follow. I think that what can potentially occur is that there is a spontaneous construction of an imagined order in the room. And that's kind of what we're trying to do in the theater.
Is that the willing suspension of disbelief? Is that the convention of, we enter into this space understanding the conventions of the space, but we're also open to the possibility of something magical happening. And everyone has that hope, I think. I hope this is good. Is that what you mean?
I think that's the thing, right? I feel like it's beyond just conventions. I think that conventions help to ground what is happening, but there's also an awareness of the context in which it sits. So I've been playing around with this idea that so let's take this example of the ritual that you've offered from Maya Daren's work in the Divine Horseman. Okay, so within this context, we have something called the text, and that text is, whether implicit or explicit, manifested in the drum beats. They follow a certain. They are, how do I say this? They stand out to us in a certain way. They're prototypical. Right. So we understand that. We also know, or at least everybody in that community understands the text that forms the archetype of whichever god decides to emerge, right? Whatever metaphysical entity it decides to emerge. The performers, right, roughly know the moves. They include backflips, they include this kind of thing. The costumers know that as well. So that's just the text, it's the thing, the object, right? And then comes the subtext, which is the subjective element, the individual interpretation. I believe you were saying either, in the previous conversation, that any one person can be ridden by the god.
Yes.
Right. So there is a subjective, individual aspect to this, but it's not so deviant that it destroys the text. It sits under it. Right. Now, that's the second point in the triangle. The third point in the triangle is the context in which it sits. All of the things that inform this particular community and how we're gathered there, whether it's in the spring or whether it's just before rainy season, or whether, somebody is coming to attack us, in the modern era, it would be something like, what's the political climate, right? What's the hot topic issue, so-called? And so when you have these 3 points, something really interesting happens. I will argue that in the theater, we're trying to draw the line between the subtext and the context, this thing that I call the transtextual line. It's something that permeates all 3 levels. It's beyond the object, it's beyond the subject's interpretation, and it's beyond the larger context in which it sits. It's something that speaks through time. That's mythical. Myth is transtextual.
Yes.
So I'll give this example. Genesis chapter 3, verse 22 is a very good example of a transtextual act. And I'm not Christian, neither am I pushing a particular religious agenda. I'm just looking at it in terms of dramatic structure. So there is, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 18 is what, this is after Adam and Eve have eaten the fruit, and then they are being judged by God. So God judges the serpent, right? And then it literally writes, and God said to the serpent, crawl on your belly, right? And then God says to Eve, and then God says to Adam, and then in verse 22, it goes, and then God said, doesn't specify who. And then God said, man has now become like us. Talk about a fourth wall break. Yeah. Right. And I've checked the translations as well. It's actually like consistent across the board.
Wow.
Yeah.
And do all of the translations also have God refer to themselves in the third person, plural?
Yeah. God says, and man has now become like us. So the question, of course, from the dramatic standpoint, from the reader standpoint, is who is this us?
Yeah.
Right. And that's God looking through the pages of the text, is looking through the good book. And this is something that is prevalent in a lot of mythical stories. So the Mahabharata does this as well, right? It begins, it's actually a play within a play. So the first chapter is the snake sacrifice, and that's where, they celebrate the story of the Mahabharata within that. And so there's something really interesting here when we think about like, oh, okay, well, that seems fairly familiar. Yeah, because Ryan Reynolds does it in Deadpool all the time.
All the time. Right. We know this. We know this trope. And we love it because now we're in on the act.
Yeah. Is this conspiracy thing?
Yes.
Is this conspiracy thing that's pulling something in? And so what's that saying to the audience? It's saying you're an active listener and we know you're there. And we know that if I make a joke about the X-Men, it's an intertextual joke, right? It's talking between objects.
Yes.
That you're going to understand it. And I trust that you will.
It's a throwback to the call and response of the griot telling a story.
Yeah.
E crack, or ago, ame, right? To have make sure that everyone's listening. You with me? You with me?
Yeah.
Now we can go. Yeah.
Yeah, and that thing is also present in the silence of stand-up comedians where they'll listen, they'll let the joke hold, and then they'll even laugh at it themselves.
Yes.
Andrew Schultz
I think
does
it's
this really
also
well.
very present in the manipulation of time that Anne Bogart was talking about, right? It's that sense of holding space in a way that calls forth a response in holding space.
Yes.
It's an active listening and a inquest, a request, an invitation.
Yes. Even if that response is silence.
Almost.
And so
more so.
Yeah. And so this is where I kind of throw in this idea, which also I'm kind of working on in terms of the audience actor relationship or audience performer relationship, is this idea of Gnostic spectatorship.
Ooh,
so
that's I love that.
It's just 5 syllables strung together. This sense of Gnostic spectatorship is that, okay, well, once you have the active listening component, right, and you know that they are with you and you've pulled them in with this sense of conspiracy, right, we're trying to get at something together. Now we have a relationship. What are we going to explore within that? And it's the Gnostic idea here, meaning that we're leveraging the use of these psychotechnologies to learn more about how we're connected into the world through an altered state of, usually powered by an altered state of consciousness. Yeah. Now, in this case, the altered state of consciousness is the buying into, or as you called it, the suspension of disbelief, right? We're called into some fictional, fictional frame. Yeah. I don't want to say fictional context because it will mess up the thing, but it's a fictional trans text, right, idea. Once we have that, okay, so the transtextual affords the active listening, the conspiracy, and then from that conspiracy, we are engaged in an altered state of consciousness from which we can learn more about our world, giving birth to Gnosticism. And so when I think about this question around what is the function of theater, it feels to me, and I'll make this as a proposal to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. I propose that the function of theater is this ontological representation, right? So we are representing through an action and time a dialectical relationship between whatever this imagined order is, you know, whether it's Hamlet or it's a ritual or it's a postmodern kind of dance piece whatsoever, and the world in which we sit, the quote unquote real world. Okay, it's a collective dialectic. We're trying to pull apart these two things so that we can take a look at each of them in relation to each other, with each other. So even if I'm Proctor and you're seated in the front row, right? I'm trying to ask you, hey, what do you think about what I'm doing? Because there's a part of my brain, half of it, that's sitting right where you are. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in your perspective. Can you share that with me? And I'm really encouraged by artists starting to do this more, which is to have these post-show talks. I do them ritualistically with my company every time we do a show, to say, okay, to hell with the, 5 chairs, let's sit down and ask the director what the vision is. That's not really moving towards Gnosticism. Instead, we're trying to transcend the end of the play, carry that conspiracy into the post-show, right? And go, let's stay in this state, guys. Let's stay in this relationship. And please tell me about how we can unlock this relationship, this dialectical relationship between the fictional context, the fictional world that we've created, and the real world, and then meet in the dialogos, meet in the logos, and hopefully come towards some higher order orientation. Because I would argue, sorry, I think I've gone on for too long. I will argue later. Please go.